Hello, my name is Cecile Badenhorst, and this video presentation is on writing the methodology chapter of a master's or PhD dissertation. I'm just going to take you through the bare bones of what would need to go into this chapter. I come from a qualitative background, so the focus of the presentation tends to be around qualitative research. There will be lots in this chapter that you can use if you're not working within qualitative research. But if you feel that it's not enough, then have a look at this chapter by Rootstam 2015 in a book called Surviving Your Dissertation. There's a chapter on writing a quantitative methodology chapter, which is really good. And it gives you all the details of how to present a quantitative research project. The first place I would start is to begin with thinking about the purpose of your chapter. What is the purpose of a methodology chapter? Well, what your reader wants to hear in this chapter is what your research approach is, why you chose this, and how you've developed this research design out of that approach. And how all of that, your research approach, your methodology, your research design, how that aligns with your overall research problem and purpose, so that everything fits together. So the purpose of the methodology chapter is to explain all of that to your reader. So like any other chapter in a thesis, your methodology chapter is really an argument. It's an argument for why you've chosen this particular methodology and not another one. And as with any other argument, you tend to have a main claim, which would be around your research approach, and then subclaims, which might be around a particular methodology or design or data collection methods. So, for example, if you choose to use in-depth interviews versus survey, you're making an argument for the value of in-depth interviews. So what I would do is to try and think about your main claim and your subclaims before you write the chapter. Write them out on index cards. Think about the evidence you'll need. So for example, with in-depth interviews, what you'll want to be doing is reading around in-depth interviews to show that with the kind of approach that you're taking, which in this case, let's say it's qualitative, that in-depth interviews are used, have been used in other research projects to access this kind of data. So you use the sources on research methodology to show that the way you've set up this project is in line with the way people have done this before. So that's your evidence. And then you don't necessarily have to provide counterclaims, but you could say, for example, while short answer questions will access this, and this, it will not give you the kind of information that you're looking for. And that's why in-depth questionnaires will be better. So there you're providing a bit of a counterclaim. So you're showing you understand the difference between the two. So that's what you're doing in the chapters. You're putting forward an argument and you're using sources to show that you understand why your methodology works in this particular way. So just to quickly, I'm sure you already know this, but just to quickly cover some of the terms, methodology is really a philosophical stance on research. It's how you see the world. Anytime you start a research project, that project is steeped within your worldview and what you think is valuable in terms of the world and in terms of knowledge about the world. The methods are the step-by-step data collection methods, so the process of collecting data. So the methodology might be a qualitative methodology that has a particular design, whereas the methods would be, I'll go and interview 10 people. So how does this research, this methodology chapter, what does it look like? As with most chapters in a dissertation, it begins with an introduction. And in the introduction, you link to the previous chapter, then you set out the purpose of this chapter, and that's your purpose, really. And then you might provide a roadmap for the reader, which says, at the beginning of the chapter, you'll discuss this, and then later on, you'll move on to these sections. In the middle of the methodology chapter, you would have a number of different sections, and they really go from broad to specific. So that's why the inverted pyramid shape is useful, because it gives you an idea of how to take your methodology chapter from that very broad perspective down to the specifics of your study. And I'll go through all of these with you. And then finally, you have a concluding paragraph where you would put a summary of the key points, and these would really be your key arguments. You might want to emphasize the key message of the chapter, and then link to the next chapter in some way. So to go back to the body of the methodology chapter, the first thing you would want to discuss is the paradigm. And depending on your discipline or department, how you set this up might be very different. In some disciplines, you're not really required to talk about the paradigm too much, whereas in other disciplines, you would need to go into it. And the paradigm is a very broad term, and it can relate to many different things. For example, you could call it a qualitative approach or a quantitative approach. Other terms for it would be to talk about positivism, or really post-positivism, or interpretivism, naturalistic research. And other terms that are used that are very popular today are the subjective interpretive approach, a critical approach, or scientific realist approach. And these are definitely not the only paradigms, and you might term it slightly differently. But the point is that there would be some overall general approach to the research that frames the entire study. This could also end up being your theoretical framework. But really what you want to do in this section is to show how this paradigm is appropriate to researching the problem at hand and to achieving the purpose of the research. And again, here you would draw on sources, and you would cite sources to show that other studies in this field who are doing similar things to you have used this kind of approach successfully. The next section is the research design, and this is really the architecture of the project. This is how everything fits together, the study type, the questions, the data collection, and how they all fit within your paradigm. So, for example, if I were doing qualitative research as my paradigm, which has its assumptions that what I'm looking at is people's experiences and how people make meaning in the world, then my research design would be a narrative research design. So this fits within the qualitative paradigm because the assumption within narrative research is that people's stories are important, that they make meaning out of telling stories, and that stories can tell us something useful about society because they are social products. So I'm not looking here at asking people for what they know. So I'm not looking for facts. I'm looking, if I'm using a narrative design, I'm looking really at how they tell us what they know. So the way they tell the story is important. So if you were looking for facts, if you were looking to see what people knew and you wanted to get that information, you would set it up very differently, and you probably wouldn't use a narrative approach. You might use a survey approach because you're looking for short answers of what people know that you can use in a different way. So there will be other ways of accessing experiences, perceptions, meanings, but the argument you're making in this chapter is why your particular research design is appropriate. So because you're making an argument for this research design, you again need to provide evidence. The next section is the data collection, and this really is where you get into the very practical part of the methodology chapter. This is the step-by-step process. So you're looking here at describing the research context. So, where's this research taking place? The population or populations, because you might have different groups of participants. The sampling procedures, the sample size. Thinking that the more detailed the transcripts are, the fewer the number of participants you need. You might also think through the recruitment process. How would you go about accessing participants? What instruments would you use? Would you actually have a questionnaire, or would you, as the researcher, be the instrument asking the questions? Would you ask participants to write things down? So this is the nitty-gritty of the data collection. And here you have to be very detailed and really think through it chronologically in terms of what you would do first and then what you would do after that. And you can even think through the logistics of things here. You know, for example, if I put up a notice recruiting participants, what would be the next step if they contacted me? So you work through it logistically. Again, here you can draw on sources. You can look at how other people have done things. You can use published research studies as examples or models. You can say you're setting up this particular project as you've read in the literature according to so and so. So cite sources to show that the way you've set up the data collection is something that has been used before or has been successfully used before. So, for example, I might say I want to access students in a university context, to do in-depth interviews so that I can access their narratives. So I'm not looking at a large sample size. I might look at maybe 10 participants in a doctoral thesis, and I will be interviewing the students myself. The next section that goes into the methodology chapter is something around the validity and reliability of the data. Now, validity and reliability are often words that are not used in qualitative research. You would use trustworthiness or something similar. But really, what you want to show here is why this data is valuable and will achieve what you want it to achieve, and that it hasn't been biased in some way, or if it has been biased, that you engage with that biasness and you discuss it, because perhaps that's what you're looking for in your research. But you want to engage with it at this point. You want to discuss how valuable this data is and what value it has. So there are a number of things in qualitative research that are commonly done to ensure the trustworthiness of the data. Things like member checks, where you take the interview transcripts back to the participants and you ask them to confirm that that the way you have interpreted the interview is something that they agree with. You can do audit trails where you document exactly what's happened through the research process. You can use triangulation, which is really around more than one source of data. But you need to be careful with triangulation because there's an assumption that you will get the same results from 3 sources of data. And that can cause a contradiction in your research. If you're coming from a research design which says people's stories are important, it's not what they're saying but how they're telling that story, then triangulation may not be a good source of validation, because it's not important to have more than one source coming up with the same result. So you need to think through that. You could also get someone else to help you look over your data to see if you have biased it in some way, or if you've altered it in some way. And then things like testing the interviews beforehand also provide some kind of validity. So again, read up on how people have provided trustworthiness in other research projects, and you can use what they've done as models and cite those sources as well. Another section that goes into the methodology chapter is the data analysis. And really, this is just your data analysis strategy. So you might begin with saying how you will organize the data. And honestly, the person that I refer to for qualitative research would be Sharon Merriam. She has a book called Qualitative Research. And she goes through, very systematically, she goes through how to set up a data analysis strategy. So it's well worth looking at her book. But you can read up on other analytical strategies. So, for example, in narrative analysis, there are so many different ways of analyzing narratives. And what I could do is take a particular author that I like and I think his or her research is worthwhile, and say, I'm going to follow the way this person analysed their data. Or I could just use a general method, which is what Sharon and Miriam does, which is the constant comparison method of analysing data. Or I could use a number of sources and then pull together an analytical scheme for myself. So, for example, I might want to look at, to analyze my narratives, I might want to look at change over time in the narrative, if there's any action, who's doing the acting, are there characters in the narrative, are there any moral messages coming through, are there metaphors coming through. So I could set up my own analytical scheme. But of course, like everything else, I'm making an argument that this is a worthwhile analytical scheme, so I would need to provide sources from the literature. But the data analysis section of a thesis is very important because it provides credibility. It provides your reader with, it provides you with credibility, and it provides your reader with confidence that you have systematically and in a very detailed way analyzed the data and that you've documented this. Other sections that could go into a methodology chapter, and this really depends on the kind of project that you're working on, but one of the more common sections that goes into this is the role of the researcher, and this often happens with qualitative research because the role of the researcher is so important. And depending on your project, you might find that this is something you want to focus on. So if you're doing research as an insider, perhaps you're a teacher doing research on teachers at your school, then your role is quite important because it affects the research process. You could be doing a more postmodern type of research project where you feel that no matter how much you try to avoid it, you are still influencing the research process and you want to reflect on that. So the role of the researcher can be quite an interesting section to have in a chapter, and it often is quite reflexive and contains a kind of subjective analysis of this research process. So that's a decision you would need to make with your supervisor and look at the requirements of your department or discipline if that's something that should be included. Other sections, often disciplines and departments require research limitations. I find that the research limitations to me are better suited in the last chapter of the thesis, but they are often found in the methodology section as well. And the other thing you might want to include, and this could come at a different point in the chapter, so for example, you could put this after the data collection methods, is the ethics. So you want to show that you've done the research ethically, and these days most students are required to get ethical clearance. So you will have already done this, I'm sure. So you need to include it to show that not only are you aware of the ethical requirements, but secondly, that you carried them out, and thirdly, how that affected the research process. So the ethics of the project are quite important. So the methodology chapter is, in my experience, usually one of the most enjoyable chapters to write. I find that students very rarely struggle with this chapter. It's an easy one. So if you are stuck at any point in your thesis, this might be the place to start. Begin with this chapter. Often you will have done quite a lot of this chapter in the proposal, but you need to redo it. You can't just cut and paste from the proposal into this chapter because things will have changed quite a bit. And this chapter requires detail and specificity, but it can be written very creatively. You don't have to be boring in your methodology chapter. You can be matter of fact, but still make it an engaging chapter. Well, that's it for the methodology chapter. If you do want more resources on writing a master's or a PhD dissertation, go to my blog and the address is up there for you to see. Thank you for listening.